Abyssal, Murmurs. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next horror stories. Story 1. The haunting ties of a mother's spirit. A family's battle beyond the grave. My mom passed away in March 2009. My parents had divorced a few years before she passed. By then, I was already married, but my siblings were still living with her until she passed, and they eventually moved in with my dad. After she passed, strange things started happening to my dad. He began hearing things and experiencing paranormal events. For example, he and my stepmom would be asleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of someone kicking the foot of their bed. He also had terrible nightmares about my mom. They sought help from a shaman, and after a ritual, the disturbances stopped. A few years later, my dad had a stroke. As he started to recover, walking a little on his own, he began seeing things again, muttering unsettling things. He was slipping away mentally. My stepmom invited another shaman to perform a ritual. They said my mom's spirit was trying to take him, making him ill. The shaman and my stepmom pleaded with her to let him go, explaining he was all we, her 7 children, had left. She wouldn't release him, so they performed a ritual to block her from him. I was there through all of it, torn between both parents, yet I knew she wasn't my mom anymore. A few weeks later, I had a vivid dream after returning home, 5 hours away. In it, my in-laws and I were moving boxes, helping my husband's brother settle into a new house. Out of nowhere, my mom appeared with a few friends to help. In the dream, I didn't realize she'd passed. Everything felt real. She told me she'd go to the store with her friends while we finished moving boxes. I waited for her to return for dinner, but she never came back. After what felt like days, I got a call. My mom was on the line, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she was lost and didn't know where she was. She mentioned her friends were dead and that she feared she was next, taken and killed off, one by one. She said she was locked up, slowly being tortured with a knife. Panicking, I tried asking for landmarks so I could send help, but she kept saying she didn't know. I grew more desperate and asked her who this person was, but she didn't know. I asked if her captor was a stranger or family. She didn't answer and hung up. I was left feeling helpless, crying uncontrollably.
I woke up sobbing, and my husband comforted me.
A few hours later, I texted my brother, who was caring for our dad, saying I missed our mom. When he asked why, I told him about my dream. After a pause, he explained that last night, a shaman had come to perform another protective ritual, hanging wooden knives and swords with markings around my dad's house to keep her spirit away. Story 2. My room's gateway. Back again with an update for you ghost story lovers. It's been about 8 months since I last posted about my encounters with the supernatural, so here's a new one for you. For context, some people say I'm destined to become a shaman, just not awakened yet. So, while what I'm about to share might seem far-fetched to some, I recently moved into an apartment in Burnsville, MN. It looks pretty standard, nothing unusual at first glance. The leasing office lady, Charlie, mentioned that my apartment had been vacant for a while and was mostly used as a temporary shelter for tenants whose apartments were being repaired. Charlie's office is directly above mine, which I thought was great, no neighbors stomping around at night. But I was wrong. Every night from around 9 p.m. until daylight, it sounds like a party above me. I hear kids running, talking, things being dropped at odd hours like 3 a.m. It was unnerving at first, but I got used to it. It's not like I can march upstairs and tell them to keep it down. and telling Charlie would just make me sound like a crazy Asian guy complaining about ghosts. Seeing and hearing things around here didn't bother me much at first, but lately I've noticed an uptick in activity, especially in my own room. If any of you readers know, you might recall parents' or grandparents' warning. Don't buy a house or rent an apartment with the bedroom door facing directly to the front door. I never understood the meaning behind this, but recently I had an experience that made me reconsider. My bedroom door is directly opposite the main door, connected by a hallway with the bathroom to the left. I always leave the hallway light on at night because I usually wake up at least once. One night, as I got up, I thought I saw someone peeking through the bottom of the main door from outside. I brushed it off, did my business, and went back to bed. 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps moving from the edge of my bed to my bedroom door. I opened my eyes to see two women standing there, and instantly I was paralyzed. I couldn't speak, but I could see them clearly. One was taller, pale, and had a dark bluish tint. The other was shorter, with messy, curly hair and a grayish appearance. I thought, "What are you doing here?" "I'm the new tenant and want no trouble. Go on your way." They didn't speak, but seemed startled by my presence. After a moment, they moved to the living room. The taller one had a suitcase, and the shorter one carried a bag. The taller woman said, "We're sorry to bother you. We are travelers and need a place to rest. May we stay here?" I thought, "Sure, but leave after you've rested." They agreed and headed into the living room. I drifted into a dream where I heard the shorter woman asking if they could have some of my food from the fridge. The taller woman told her no, but I chimed in, "You can have the watermelon on the plate, but nothing else." They thanked me and ate the watermelon. When I woke up in the morning, I saw the plate of watermelon still on the counter. I thought, "Damn, I must have forgotten to put it in the fridge last night, and that's why they asked about it." I tossed it in the trash and cut up a new batch. 2 nights later, a man and his young son appeared. Like the women, they asked for permission to rest. I asked why they kept coming through my place and where they were coming from. The man replied, "Your bedroom and doorway are a gateway between the human and spirit worlds. It's always been here, you just didn't know. There are many gateways, but this is the closest one for some of us. We know you're kind-hearted and have a high spiritual authority, so we try not to disturb you." I agreed they could rest, but added, "Please tell others to keep the noise down. Stay hidden and don't touch any food in the fridge." The man nodded and left with his son. Since then, I haven't left food out, and I rarely hear or see them anymore, except for my bedroom door, which creaks open occasionally. It's all part of the charm. Ghost stories don't just come from nowhere. They start in rooms like mine. Story 3. Shadow People. I've lived in Fresno, most of my life. In fact, I'm still here. Anyway, my family and I once lived in an old house on the west side of town, right down the street from Edison High School, just to give you a general location. That house was creepy. After we moved in, our neighbors would ask if we'd experienced anything strange. They mentioned that most families who moved in didn't last more than a month, saying the place was haunted. Being hung, of course, we didn't let it get to us. Then one late night, as I was sleeping, I suddenly woke up coughing from a strong smell of dried chili peppers roasting on the stove. The scent was so intense it filled the entire house. I asked my older brother, who was still up watching TV, why it smelled like that. He said, "Don't worry about it. Mom's doing it." I didn't think much of it and just nodded. Since I couldn't fall back asleep, I stayed up with my younger brother, who had woken up to the smell as well. We started playing video games in our room while our older brother continued watching TV in the living room. A little later, he came into our room and handed me a hum knife, telling me that if I heard him scream, I should run out there with it. I hesitated and asked him why. That's when he finally told me the story. We had a big pit bull that roamed freely in our backyard. My brother said that tonight the dog was acting strange, like it was chasing something around. So, our mom had decided to burn the peppers, maybe to ward off whatever was lurking around. My brother mentioned he was going to try pretending to sleep to catch whatever was disturbing the dog. I agreed and stayed up to watch my younger brother play games while our older brother went back to the living room. Eventually, he did fall asleep. I could hear him snoring. It was around 3 a.m. when things took a turn for the terrifying. All the lights in the house were off, except the TV, which gave off a faint glow. Our bedroom door was open, and looking out, I saw nothing but darkness in the hallway, with just a hint of light spilling over from the TV. All of a sudden, the house went quiet and still, just like in a horror movie. Then, I heard little footsteps running up and down the hallway, starting from halfway down and heading toward the backyard door. My skin began to crawl, but I didn't say anything to my younger brother. I didn't want him to panic. The footsteps continued back and forth, up and down the hall. After a while, they stopped. I was straining my ears, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I heard something playing with water, like someone scooping water and letting it drip back down slowly. Drip, drip, drip. The only source of water I could think of was the toilet. I mean, what else could it be? After a while, that sound stopped, and the running resumed up and down the hall. Suddenly, the footsteps ran all the way up to our bedroom door and stopped. I was staring straight at the open door, just darkness beyond it. I leaned back, clutching the knife, preparing to throw it at whatever might appear. With barely any light spilling into the hallway from the TV, I saw it. A dark shadow or black smoke appeared in the doorway. It looked like someone leaning against the doorframe, peering into the room. The figure was human-shaped, but seemed more like a black cloud of smoke. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down, like it knew I had seen it. It slipped back behind the door, and all I could hear were footsteps racing down the hallway and out to the backyard. I sat there, frozen, unable to move or even breathe, not knowing what to think. And then I heard the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. Somehow I knew it was that thing. I could hear it in the backyard, gurgling, It started loud and gradually faded as it moved farther away. I couldn't help but feel that it knew the night was ending and that dawn was near. The sky was beginning to lighten with a dark blue hue, marking the transition from night to day. This is one of my personal experiences, and I don't know if you'll believe me, but it's something I'll never forget. Sorry for the long story, but thanks for reading. Story 4. Working in the fields. One day, when my mother was still a little girl, around 12 years old, her grandmother sent her out early in the morning to work in the field. Her grandmother told her, "Your father was out hunting all night, and he will be coming home soon. I need to prepare food for him and get food ready for our meal in the fields. When he returns, the two of us will join you there." My mother told her grandmother, "It's still dark out, and I'm scared to go to the fields alone." But her grandmother scolded her and insisted that she go. Reluctantly, my mother made her way alone to the fields. As my mother walked along the path, she saw a young girl walking ahead of her. When she looked closely, she thought it resembled her aunt's daughter. She called out for her to wait, but the girl started walking faster. My mother began to run after her, calling for her to wait, but the girl just sped up. My mother started to wonder, why isn't she waiting for me? She finally called out, "If you won't wait for me, then I'll go on by myself." Then, she noticed something unusual. The girl was wearing the shoes of a dead person. Terrified, my mother dropped her basket and hoe on the path and ran home, crying. Along the way, she met 3 women, one of them related to my grandfather, who were on their way to the fields. When they saw my mother crying and running towards them, they were frightened too. But the woman related to my grandfather recognized her and called out to her. My mother ran over to her, but she was crying so much she couldn't even speak. The 3 women then took my mother back home. When they got home, my mother's grandmother scolded her. "Why are you crying so much? What happened to you?" By this time, my grandfather had arrived home as well. The woman who had seen my mother told him what happened, that they were on their way to the fields and saw her daughter running toward them, crying, but unable to speak. So they decided to bring her home. My grandfather asked my mother why she was crying so much. She then explained that she was on her way to the fields and saw someone who looked like her aunt's daughter, but she was wearing the shoes of a dead person. Furious, my grandfather scolded her grandmother. "Why did you send my daughter to the fields alone?" Afterward, he took his gun and followed the path to the fields. When he reached the spot where my mother had dropped her basket and hoe, he saw a snake slithering across the path. My grandfather stood there and spoke. "How dare you? Our children only go out to find food and survive, and they walk on the path meant for everyone. Stay where you belong, and we'll stay where we belong. You come here to scare our children. Aren't you ashamed under the heavens?" After that, they performed a ritual and called back my mother's spirit. They even changed her name. Story 5. The Visitor Who Couldn't Enter. I'd like to share a story that took place back in 1999. My ex-husband and I had just bought an old house in Warren, MI. According to the sales agent, the original owners had passed away and left the property to their son and his wife. Shortly after we moved in, I had a strange dream one morning, right before my alarm went off for work. In the dream, an elderly Caucasian woman rang our doorbell. I got up and opened the door, and she asked if we had bought the house from her son because she couldn't enter anymore. I replied that we had indeed bought it from a couple who had moved up north. She then asked if I knew where her son and daughter-in-law had gone, explaining that she was looking for them. I told her that they'd built a new home up north, though I wasn't sure of the exact city. She nodded, said thank you, and left just as my alarm sounded, waking me up. When I told my ex-husband about the dream, he brushed it off, saying it was probably just my imagination. But a few months later, we attended the same church as the previous owners of the house, where I saw a family picture that included the mother. My heart stopped. She looked exactly like the woman from my dream. Ever since we moved in, our doorbell has occasionally rung on its own, even after we replaced the batteries. Though I don't think it's a ghost, I sometimes wonder if dreams are a way for those who have passed to communicate with their loved ones. Story 6. The Little Hut. I heard this story over 25 years ago. I can't remember all the fine details, but thinking about the story still gives me the shivers. A long time ago, back in Laos, a Hum gentleman was traveling back home by himself. He was walking on a dirt path. By the time he noticed his surroundings, it was already nightfall, and the night insects were making noises. He was tired and decided to seek out the nearest shelter. Soon, he came upon a small, empty hut. He went inside the hut to settle down for the night. After making a bed, he laid down to sleep. A small fire was burning close to him, which allowed him to see a little of his surroundings. As the small fire started to die, he was about to fall asleep when he heard a weird sound from far away. He listened closely, but couldn't make out to what the sound was. Then, the sound started moving slowly toward the hut. Soon, he could hear the strange sound more clearly. It sounded like someone was playing with their tongue. When the storyteller told me this story, she moved her tongue around in her mouth to mimic the sound. The sound was scary. The sound she made sounded like when you want to tickle a child. So you use your finger to play with your lips before tickling the child. Blue, 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 blub, blue, blue, blue. Okay, back to the story. So, as the sound got closer to the hut, the gentleman didn't know what to do. He couldn't run out of the hut, because what if that thing making the sound decided to chase after him? Luckily, he had a Mung rifle for protection. He pulled out his rifle, loaded and prepared it, then aimed it towards the foot of his bed. He lay very still, so it looked like he was asleep. The sound got closer and closer until it was right outside the hut. Then it stopped. By this time, he didn't know what would happen next. With his heart pounding, he held on tightly to his rifle and was ready to shoot at anything. Then, he saw a creature stand up from the foot of his bed. The creature was huge, dark, and hairy. It was so much bigger and taller than him. Immediately, he shot at the creature. When the smoke from his rifle cleared, the creature was gone. The gentleman decided not to stay in the hut anymore. He returned to the dirt path and walked home as fast as possible while carrying his rifle. Story 7. The Nurse's Last Ride. I read this in a website the other day and wanted to share it. Prior to starting school here at Michigan, I worked a few odd jobs. One such job was as a night shift nursing assistant for an ICU. In the ICU, we generally kept the sickest patients in the hospital. These were people who could be in recovery after having intensive surgery or just needed to be continuously monitored because they were at risk of a health scare. This ICU had 12 rooms, with one nurse assigned to each room and one nurse's aide. That's me, assigned to each of them. One of the perks of the night shift was that things were much slower as opposed to the day shift because most patients slept during the night. Unfortunately, however, this also meant a reduction in the number of nurses and nurses' aides during your shift, so the nurses' aide might find themselves performing jobs alone. During my interview for the job, I was warned by my supervisor that one of my responsibilities was to take deceased patients, slide them into a body bag, toe tag them, slide the body on a metal stretcher, and throw a dark blue tarp over the body. On this night in particular, I was scheduled alone and we were relatively short-staffed. One of my patients was not doing well. We had given CPR twice already, and we were only 4 hours into my shift. At about 2 on that morning, the patient's blood pressure dropped and passed away. I cleaned the body up so that when the family arrived, they could say their goodbyes and went back to work elsewhere. The time eventually came for the body to be transported downstairs. The entire hospital at this time was extremely busy. We sometimes called a transporter to take the body down, but they had been backed up for about 2 hours, and being that it is against hospital protocol to keep a deceased body in a room for a certain amount of time before a new patient arrives, we wanted to get this done as soon as possible. Being the arrogant 22-year-old strongman that I was, I volunteered to take the body down myself. After the family left, I bagged the body, put a tag on it, and head down to the morgue. In the basement, I retrieve a specialized cart for a deceased body using the utility elevators. I run back upstairs, slide the body onto the cart, and head to the same elevator. I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared shitless, but all of my favorite nurses were working, and I really wanted to help out. I had always felt weird transporting bodies in the hospital because you run the risk of running into a visitor. You are required to use certain elevators out of the public eye to move the body, because who wants to ride in an elevator with a corpse, right? I pushed the body into this giant elevator in the stockroom and hit the button down for the basement. Strangely, the elevator stalls, and instead of going down to the bottom floor, it jumps up 2 floors to the 4th floor to the newborn nursery. The B was still highlighted on the elevator, and I figured maybe someone had just hit the button before I had and forced the elevator up. I repeatedly press the B button again, and the doors close. The elevator goes down to the 2nd floor, stops, travels down to the basement, stops once more without the doors opening, and then travels back up to the 4th floor where the doors open once more. The elevator does this 2 more times. Having seen enough scary movies in my lifetime, I ended up just staying on the 4th floor, calling my charge nurse and telling her I don't feel comfortable putting this body in the morgue alone. After about 5 minutes, she runs up and explains to me that this elevator isn't even supposed to travel to the 4th floor without a key, and during her rounds of the hospital at around 7 p.m., she had used this same elevator and it had been working perfectly. We eventually take the body down to the morgue and head back upstairs. We start telling everyone in the ICU what happened, and one of the nurses who had been caring for the patient brought up how the woman was actually a neonatal nurse during the 80s and was forced to go on disability due to complications with MSA. The 4th floor at this hospital was the neonatal floor, and she suggested that maybe the spirit of this deceased patient had been trying to go back to the job that she loved. Story 8. Never Make an Offering, Part 1. This is a long story, and it's a personal encounter that happened to me 2 years ago, in the middle of July. My friends and I decided to go camping in Duluth, Minnesota, though I don't remember the exact campsite. There were 5 of us, altogether 3 boys and 2 girls. We arrived at our campsite around 4 p.m., set up our tents, and checked out the area. It was super fun, and everything was going well. Around 9 p.m., we all decided to gather around the campfire and tell stories. At first, we talked about what we'd do for the next 2 days of camping, but then the conversation shifted to ghost stories. Note, names will be changed for privacy. Let's call my friends 2B, Seng, and Chia, and I'll go by me. They started by telling us a story about a ghost encounter his uncle had in Laos when he was younger. As he was finishing his story, I started feeling as if something was watching us from the woods. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. Then, as we were listening to another story, Singh decided to make a joke about me. He's the type who says things without thinking. He yelled into the dark woods, "Hey, my friend me here is lonely and single. Come and take her to be your wife." I was furious. Who would say something like that? His girlfriend smacked him on the head, calling him stupid, and the other 2 guys told him he shouldn't joke like that because something bad could happen. I told him that if anything did happen to me, he'd be the first person I'd drag along. He just laughed and said it was only a joke. Upset, I stormed off to my tent, and his girlfriend came with me. She and I shared one tent while the other 3 slept in a big tent together. I'm not sure what time it was, but I couldn't sleep after what had happened. With my eyes closed, I heard leaves crackling outside. I thought it was probably just a raccoon. Then, I heard a distant voice calling my name from the woods. It was a low, breathless male voice repeating, "Mimi, come with us." I was terrified. I kept wondering if it was real or if I was dreaming. I whispered to Chia to wake her up, but she didn't respond. Frozen in fear, I knew that whatever was calling me wasn't human. As I pretended to sleep, the voice became clearer. "Mimi, come with us." I opened one eye slightly and, under the moonlight, saw the silhouette of a tall man.
His raspy breath echoed near my tent. I tried to wake Chia, but I was too scared to move.
Then I saw the figure slowly approach the tent door, as if it were about to unzip it. Somehow, I found the courage to scream as loud as I could, jolting Chia awake. She shot up, gasping for breath, as if she'd been suffocating. We were both in tears, and the guys rushed over to our tent. To my surprise, Chia was crying too. She hugged me, apologizing, and the guys asked what had happened. Once we calmed down, we explained what we'd experienced. Chia, furious and frightened, started hitting Seng, blaming him. She told us, "A dark shadow came to me and said it was going to take me because she'd been offered to him."
I felt chills down my spine.
We all looked at each other, knowing we had to leave immediately. We packed everything as quickly as possible and headed to the car. As we were about to leave, we heard the voice calling my name again. We bolted to the car, got in, and drove off. B suggested we go to his house since his father is a shaman. As we were driving away, everything went completely black for me. Story 9, Never Make an Offering, Part 2. This part is from my friends and family's point of view. During the ride back home, I completely blacked out. As we parked outside B's parents' house, I kept mumbling to myself. Chia thought I was waking up, so she shook me to let me know we had arrived. I slowly lifted my head and gave her a creepy grin. Chia was frightened, but she stayed calm and reminded everyone that B's father would protect us. They all helped me out of the car, but I wasn't myself anymore. I just kept grinning at them in a disturbing way and mumbling incoherently. Inside the house, B's family was already up, waiting for us. B's father had also asked 2 of B's uncles to come over and help. As soon as we walked in, I started laughing hysterically. B's father told his wife to call my parents and inform them that an evil entity had followed me, but that they would do their best to protect me. I forgot to mention earlier that B and I are cousins. B's mother was told to let my parents know they shouldn't come until it was safe. They sat me down in a chair, and before B's father began the ritual, he asked what had happened. When they explained, he was furious and told Seng that if anything serious happened to me, he'd be responsible. As B's father began the ritual, I suddenly started crying, looked straight at Seng, and in my normal voice said, "I will drag you along with me." Then, I began shaking as if having a seizure. It was horrifying. The ritual seemed to go on forever, but B's father eventually managed to fight off whatever had taken over my body. It all ended around 4 a.m. B's father gave each of us a white and red bracelet he made for protection, and I was also given a new name for added safety. I didn't wake up until 5 a.m. When I finally woke up, I cried to my mom, saying that a man had tried to take me. She assured me that my uncle had protected me. Everyone asked if I remembered anything. I told them I only remembered what had happened at camp and the drive back. Sang asked if I was sure because, during the ritual, I had told him I was going to drag him along. I didn't recall that at all. I only remembered a dream that felt very real. I was running through the dark woods, trying to find my way out. I kept hearing the same male voice calling, "Mimi, come, let's go." Then I heard a softer, welcoming voice calling out to me, "Minixais, Roz Kov Lub Swab, Kovuav, Tiver, Koji, Thiab, Kosh, Kojo, Koje, Chu." "Daughter, listen to my voice. I will protect you and bring you back to your family." I followed this voice and could hear everyone crying and calling out to me. After the incident, we all stayed at B's house. Our parents came over and discussed what had happened. Seng's parents lectured him about his behavior, and B's father warned us not to go out far anymore for our safety. He also reminded everyone to only call me by my new name. Afterward, Seng apologized for what he had done. I forgave him, but warned him to be more careful with his words next time. It could be him. I haven't gone camping since. Sorry, I know my story was long. I hope you all enjoyed it, and have a happy Halloween. Story 10. The Resident on Hospice Care. I used to work as a nurse in a nursing home, where we referred to our patients as residents because they live in our facility. Some of these residents were on hospice care, meaning they had a limited time to live, and our goal was to keep them comfortable. Once, I took care of a hospice resident who had previously been able to sit in a wheelchair and eat at the dining table. But now, he was bedridden, unable to eat or drink. Having cared for several hospice residents before, I felt comfortable working with him. I checked on him frequently throughout my shift to give him medications, perform care, and so on. There was nothing unusual about him that was, until one afternoon. It was around 3 p.m. when I entered his room and saw that 4 or 5 people were visiting him. His visitors were friendly, greeting me warmly. But as I exchanged greetings with them, goosebumps rose on my arms, and the hairs on the back of my neck and head stood up. I thought it strange to sense a ghostly presence when his visitors seemed normal. I tried to shake off the feeling and ignore it. Suddenly, my heart began racing, as if I was unconsciously becoming fearful of something or someone evil in the room that I couldn't see. I realized these were the same feelings I'd experienced in the past during ghostly hauntings. I silently prayed for God's protection before turning to check on my resident. I noticed he was staring into space as he lay in bed. I quickly completed my tasks and left the room. 2 days later, I was caring for him again. Around 8 or 9 p.m., I approached his door and saw that his room was completely dark, with only the dim glow of the nightlight. I assumed his visitors, or the nursing assistants, had turned off all the lights when they left. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out his body lying in bed. The door had been left open, but I still knocked, announced that I was his nurse, and was there to check on him. I flipped the light switch beside me, still standing in the doorway. Although the light was not very bright, I could see him lying in bed with his head turned toward me. I walked closer and told him I was going to turn on the bright light. He didn't respond as usual. When I turned on the bright light and looked at him, he was lying with his eyes wide open, unblinking. I called his name and waved my hand in front of his face, but he didn't respond or blink. I followed his gaze and realized he was staring at the door I'd entered through. Checking his vital signs, I found no pulse, heartbeat, or breath sounds he had died. It dawned on me that he had passed while staring at the doorway, as if someone had entered and said, "It's time to go." Remembering the evil presence I had sensed in his room before, I couldn't help but wonder if something sinister had come to take his soul. Standing alone in his room, I didn't feel afraid or notice anything unusual, possibly because I had prayed for God's protection earlier. although this incident happened almost 10 years ago. Story 11. The Dragon of Los Banos, Reservoir, Lake. Since it's almost Halloween, I'll be sharing a short story of something that I experienced. Through this short story, I am also giving a warning for those who read this to be cautious. I hope you all enjoy this story, and hope you all have a happy Halloween. I call this short story. Every time I drive to the beach, I pass the lake in Los Banos, perched up on a hill with a road winding along the base. Without fail, I turn my head to look at it. Though there's nothing remarkable about the lake, whether the water is high or low, green or blue, whether it's crowded or deserted, day or night. And yet, I'm drawn to it, unable to look away, even though fishing or lakeside views don't hold much interest for me. Then there were 2 times when I drove past that lake in broad daylight, and I got chills and somehow became afraid of the water. Fast forward. So about 5+ years ago, I went out of town and was making my way back home and drove past the lake in Los Banos during the late afternoon. When I made my way down towards the bottom of the hills and was driving away from the lake, I suddenly heard a faint voice calling out to me, claiming she was my mother from my past life. She was saying in Hmong, "I see you. Where are you going? Come back and bring back Mother's orb/pearl. Mother is dying." I was a bit confused and kept on driving away from the lake. And then the voice continued by saying, "Where are you going? Come back. Mother is floating in the sky above the lake. You are shiny and Mother can see you. Bring back Mother's orb/pearl. Mother is going to die." As I drove away, the voice added, "Mother can't come over there. Come back to the lake." Then I heard another urgent voice telling me, "It's a dragon." So then I continued on driving along with the other cars on the road and headed home. Then a few months passed. I discovered that my dad had gone fishing at that lake a few years prior to this experience. He said he went fishing with a few friends, and when they arrived at the lake, my dad decided to go fishing at an isolated spot away from his friends. Just within a few minutes of fishing, he noticed the water running along the shore started flashing red. Then the water would turn back to normal, and then it'll flash red again. My dad became afraid, and he walked away to find his friends. I was also informed that dragons are very cunning and knows a lot of information about an individual, which explains why this dragon was fabricating a story to trick me. I was told that dragons can sense things around their surroundings and can read people's thoughts and intentions. They know a person's past, present, and future, and they know what or who a person's soul is. So beware of dragons, and be careful for those of you who go fishing at this lake, or for those of you who drive past this lake. Story 12. The Visitor Beyond the Door. When I was 22, my cousin and I went to our friend's birthday party. Usually, he comes to our side of town to hang out, but this time he invited us over to his. It was a typical Hmong birthday party, lots of drinking and people hanging out. When the party ended, my cousin and I drove home together, but decided to stop at the McDonald's on Ashland and West. We hung out for a bit, then went our separate ways. That night, I got home and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to get some water. When I returned to bed, I noticed a silhouette of a woman standing by the side door in my room, the one that led to the front yard. Fear hit me instantly, and I tried to move, but I was paralyzed. The figure pointed at me and, in Hmong, said, "Last night, when you were coming home, I followed you." I struggled, trying to break free from the paralysis. When I finally did, it was daylight. I called my cousin and asked him if he felt anything strange. He admitted he had, but shrugged it off, saying we were probably just drunk. I tried to brush it off too, but I kept seeing the same visitor. Some nights, when I left the door open, I could feel a presence or see a silhouette of a woman moving past the screen door. It even began imitating people I knew. I'd hear my brother's voice, who hadn't lived with me for over 2 years, say, "Hey, I'm home, bro. Open the door." But when I looked, it was a distorted version of him, or sometimes a younger version. Occasionally, I would wake up standing by the door, my hand on the doorknob, realizing I had been sleepwalking. I knew that if I opened it, I would be inviting whatever was haunting me inside. This continued for about a year. Then, I started dating my ex-girlfriend. One night, she woke me up while she was doing homework. The lamp was on, so she could see me struggling and woke me from my paralysis. When she asked what was going on, I finally told her about the experiences. A few days later, she brought me a charm her grandmother had blessed. From the moment I started wearing it, the visits stopped. Since then, I haven't experienced anything. Story 13. Possessed by a wild, evil spirit. Back in Laos, when my aunt was a little girl, around 6 or 7, she and her friends would often play in the woods. One day, they found a toad under a fallen log and began to poke it with sticks, laughing as it hopped away each time. But then one of the other girls my aunt's age started hitting it harder, injuring it so badly it could no longer hop. She didn't stop there. Instead, she began tormenting it, poking holes in its body. The toad bled and cried. When she finally swept the toad with her stick, it rolled across the ground, staggered back up on its legs, and flew away. The children froze, staring in shock, before breaking into a run out of the woods and back home, terrified by what they had seen. That night, the girl who tortured the toad became sick, moaning and groaning as if in a fevered daze. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Day by day, she grew paler and weaker, refusing to leave her home. She spent most of her time speaking to herself in a voice that was unnaturally deep and raspy. Her grandmother, embarrassed by this, would sometimes urge her to stop, and for a moment she would go silent. Everyone could tell something was wrong. One evening, her father went quietly to summon a shaman, but before he arrived, she somehow knew and, in that low, sinister voice, began cursing those around her for trying to disturb her. When the shaman arrived and performed his ritual, it had no effect. As days passed, her appearance began to change. Her skin became rough and blotchy, almost toad-like, and her face, hands, and feet grew aged beyond her years. Her fingernails thickened, darkened, and lengthened into twisted claws. At night, while the family tried to sleep, she would sit up in bed in an unnatural position, muttering to herself and growling in a man's voice. Her siblings were too frightened to share a room with her. She stopped joining the family for meals, choosing instead to hunch in a corner, eating with her dirty hands like a wild animal. On nights when she demanded meat for the old grandpa, villagers would discover one of their cows slaughtered by morning, its body torn as if by some feral creature. Her family and neighbors grew terrified. Some families even considered moving away. Despite the efforts of more shamans, no one could cure her. They said she had been possessed by a wild, evil spirit from the woods, a powerful entity, invoked by the wounded toad's plea for vengeance. For months, she grew increasingly sick and deranged, her humanity slipping away until, at last, she died. Story 14. The Haunting of Lake Michigan House. Here's a story my older brother shared about just how haunted Wisconsin is, where he lives. One of his good friends and his wife recently bought a house near Lake Michigan. Thrilled, the friend invited all his family and friends over for a housewarming party. My brother, one of the attendees, noticed that the house was an older colonial-style home rather than a modern one. After a few beers, he asked his friend, "When was this place built?" "It has a colonial look to it," the friend replied. "This house was built in the Lot 60s by the original owner." My brother couldn't shake the eerie vibe but brushed it off. A few weeks later, his friend came to him at work, looking a bit uneasy, and asked, "Hey, do you know of any shamans around here?" Surprised, my brother said he didn't. His friend explained that strange things had started happening in the house. His 3-year-old son kept seeing a man walking around the second floor at night, describing him as a Caucasian man. The family also heard footsteps running up and down the stairs after everyone had gone to bed. To calm his wife's nerves, the friend dismissed it as old house noises. In a joking tone, my brother suggested, "Why don't you string some fishing line with cans along the staircase to catch any ghosts?" They laughed it off, but the friend decided to give it a try. The next day at work, my brother saw his friend looking pale and on edge. "You okay?" he asked. His friend answered, "Dude, I think my house is haunted." He explained that after putting the kids to bed the night before, he noticed his youngest child, who had been talking about seeing someone in the house, wasn't in bed. He found the boy downstairs on the couch, watching TV. He called to his son to come up, and the child turned off the TV and began climbing the stairs. But suddenly, he froze, staring at a dark corner of the living room, then let out a loud cry and ran up the stairs. When his father asked what he'd seen, the boy, visibly shaken, said, "It was the white guy I told you about, and he was mad because I turned off the TV." Remembering the fishing line setup, the friend put it along the staircase that night. As he and his wife lay in bed, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps and cans rattling. The footsteps continued throughout the night, filling them with dread and making it impossible to sleep. My brother advised him to either move out or find a shaman. The friend agreed and hired a shaman from Minnesota to bless the house. After hours of jingle bells and chanting, the shaman looked at the friend with a grave expression and said, "They're not leaving. They've been here since the house was built. This is their home." Disturbed, the friend asked what she meant. The shaman explained that the spirits he was seeing were those of the original owner and his family, continuing their routines as they had when alive. She added that, to the dead, day is night, and night is day. A few weeks later, after careful consideration, the friend and his wife decided to let the house go back to the bank. They packed up and moved to California, leaving the spirits to their haunted routine. Story 15. The Vengeful Spirit of the Lost Child, a Village's Dark Secret. Long ago in Laos, before the Vietnam War, there was a small village of around 50 Hmong people. In this village lived a young woman who was mentally challenged, unable to speak properly, and with no family to care for her. She was treated poorly by everyone, constantly bullied and abused. With no home, she found shelter in the village garden, enduring a harsh life on her own. One day, a man from the village, driven by his own twisted desires, began to assault her. This abuse continued until she became pregnant. The entire village noticed her pregnancy, but no one cared to help her or find out who the father was. As her time for labor approached, the man who had wronged her grew fearful that the birth would reveal him as the father. In desperation, he sought her out murdered her before she could give birth, and buried the unborn child in a hidden location. The villagers found her body but performed no rituals, burying her without the traditional respect. A few weeks after her burial, strange events began to unfold. One day, an elder noticed a severe drought at the village's pond, so he followed the bamboo water channel into the forest, clearing away branches and leaves as he went. Suddenly, he looked up and saw the spirit of the woman, her hand blocking the water's flow. Shocked, he whispered, "But you're dead." She approached him, struggling to speak, but her words were garbled. Terrified, the elder shouted, "You're dead! Leave me, or I'll kill you again." Enraged, her spirit scratched his chest before disappearing into the trees. That same night, the elder died. The villagers were horrified, fearing the restless spirit's wrath. They consulted their shaman, who performed a ritual and revealed that the woman's spirit was searching for her lost child. The village leader called a meeting, urging the child's father to confess and reveal the burial place. Weeks passed without anyone coming forward, and villagers continued to die, each found with scratches across their chest. Finally, the guilty man confessed, leading the villagers to the burial site deep in the forest. Together, they exhumed the child's remains and buried it with the mother, hoping this would bring her peace. However, peace was short-lived. Days later, a hunter ventured into the forest, where he glimpsed the woman's spirit. Desperate to show his courage, he shot at her with his bow, only to find a human hand left in place of his arrow's target. The villagers took the hand to the shaman, who performed another ritual, learning that the woman's spirit was still not at rest. She sought revenge for her mistreatment, vowing to harm the villagers and their livestock. Soon after, travelers passing through reported seeing a bloody, battered woman by the creek, warning the villagers of worse to come if her spirit wasn't appeased. Fearing for their lives, the village leader hired a powerful shaman from another village to put her spirit to rest. The shaman instructed everyone to stay indoors that night, and he hid in the bushes near the woman's grave, waiting. In the dead of night, he heard the cries of a cow being torn apart. As he peered out from his hiding place, he saw a massive, blood-stained tiger stalking through the field. Behind the tiger, he caught sight of the woman's spirit, holding her child's hand. Realizing the tiger was her vengeful form, the shaman took his bow, chanted a ritual over the arrow, and shot it straight into her heart. She collapsed over her grave, and by morning, the villagers found the tiger's body. They decapitated it, burying its head in the village to prevent her return, while laying the rest of the body beside the woman and her child. Since that day, the village has been at peace, and her spirit has never returned. Story 16. My Grandma. This happened in 2008, the year I was going to graduate from high school. I'd never seen a ghost, nor had that eerie feeling that people describe, like when your hair stands on end and a chill runs down your spine, indicating a spirit's presence. This experience was my first. Before I tell my story, I should mention that I was the first daughter to get married in my family, and at a very young age. I was the only one who listened and did things for my grandma, but after I got married, she became sick and couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't visit her because my husband was strict, and I didn't know how to drive at that time. So, here's my story. On my last day of senior year, I was so happy, smiling from ear to ear. I drove to school, parked in the lot, and was about to grab my backpack when my cell phone rang. I thought, it's strange. My mom never calls me this early. I picked up the phone. Hello. My sister answered with a shaky, tearful voice. "Annie," she said, then paused for what felt like 5 minutes. "Annie, Grandma has left us." The moment she said those words, tears started streaming down my face, and my happy smile faded into sadness. "What time did she pass?" I asked. "She left us at 4 a.m. this morning," she replied. "Why didn't you guys call me earlier?" I asked, crying harder. "Mom didn't want to wake you since you had school," she explained. So many thoughts rushed through my mind. I was upset they hadn't called me. After we hung up, I stayed in my car, crying and mourning out loud. But eventually, I composed myself since class was about to start. After my grandma's funeral, this is when it began. After we buried my grandma, I went home that night feeling strange, though I didn't think much of it. I was still heartbroken. That night, I had a vivid dream where my grandma came to see me. It felt so real. To this day, I wonder if it was more than just a dream. Maybe her spirit truly came to visit and stayed with me that night. The day after her burial, I continued feeling strange. Goosebumps covered my arms, and I felt as if someone was watching me. This feeling wouldn't go away, even when I was alone, like in the shower, where it felt like someone was sitting on the toilet nearby. 13 days passed, and I still had that eerie sensation, as though my grandma's spirit lingered with me. I didn't tell anyone, pretending everything was fine, but every night for those 13 days, I dreamed of my grandma. Finally, on the 13th day, we held the traditional hunk soplag, let the spirit go, ceremony. I felt conflicted about attending because, by then, I knew she had been with me for those 13 days, watching over me. After the ceremony, I never had another dream of her. Talking about my grandma fills me with longing. I believe she stayed with me for those 13 days because she missed me after I left to get married. I was the only one who would spend time with her, while my sisters mostly stayed in their rooms. I was there for her, and she came back to be with me one last time. Story 17, Close Presence. The first one is not a Hong story, but an Indian one. I'm pretty sure something we Hum people have a story similar like this too. My English teacher was telling us this story about her professor's story when my English teacher was still in college. BTW. I will be telling this in my English teacher's point of view, so it'll be easier to understand. Have you ever felt like there was something strong, a presence hovering over you or near you? We Indian and Muslim don't get along because of our religions and etc. That's why it's best recommended to not fall in love with a Muslim or even marry them. My professor is Indian, and for some time in her life, there was a presence near her and hovering her. Back in India, my professor, who was not even born yet, was still in her mother's stomach, had an uncle who fell in love with a Muslim girl. My professor uncle started to see the Muslim girl. One time, the uncle was caught with the Muslim girl by her older brothers. "If I see you next time with my sister, you'll never be able to see the light again," said one of the Muslim brothers. Now, what they said sounded like a threat toward the uncle, but he wasn't scared and continuing on seeing the Muslim girl. One day, when it reached nighttime, the uncle didn't come home. It kept on happening until the uncle's family decided to go look for him. After a couple of days looking, they walked along the railroad tracks and saw pieces of the human body scattered around the area. Now the uncle's family started to really worry about what could have happened. Finally, one of the family members that was searching for the uncle stumbled upon a head. They turned the head, and immediately, all of them were shocked to the core. The day they found the uncle's body parts and head was when my professor was born, the same very day. In all of my professor's life, she felt like there was something that she couldn't figure out latched onto her. My professor had given birth to a baby, and with a baby along, surely a bigger space would be helpful. So then my professor decided to get an apartment for her and her newborn baby. Within the first few nights, everything went well, until suddenly weird things started to happen in the apartment. My professor was a very strong lady, and nothing really bothered her. However, this time was different. When the baby and the professor left the apartment and came back home later, some things were found in the wrong places, or were never even placed there in the first place. My professor was the only one with the key to her apartment, so that made her even more suspicious as what was going to happen. Even my professor thought to herself if she was going crazy, or was it all in her imagination. Surely and thankfully, one evening night, when my professor was heading to sleep after putting her baby to bed into its crib, there was a bunch of loud noises coming from the kitchen area. Furiously angry and having had enough of the noises and misplacements of the things in her apartment, my professor grabbed her baby boy and her keys and rushed out of the apartment. Since the front door leading outside was near the kitchen, she looked at the kitchen and was shocked at what happened. All the dishes that were inside the cabinets had fallen to pieces on the floor, and the cabinets were broken. Some of them were wide open. My professor had had enough and left digging for answers. Immediately, she told and asked her parents what has happened at the apartment. Now, my professor's parents were super religious and knew they needed to seek help for their daughter. The mom, dad, and my professor sought help from a priest. The priest greeted and bowed to the dad, then to the mom, then to my professor, and finally, lastly bowed to nobody besides the professor. Oh, now the parents and especially my professor got very frightened. "Why did you bow and greet 4 times when only 3 of us came?" asked the mother to the priest. "You guys brought someone else along too," answered the priest. "It was just them 3 that was here, unless the 4th one was a spirit unseen to them." My professor explained everything to the priest about the presence that was always beside her and what had happened at the apartment. "The day you were born, your family found your decapitated uncle. Ever since then, he's been latching on you because your family hadn't cremated him. He wants to be cremated so he can go and not be latched onto you no more. That's his only wish, to be free," explained the priest. It all made sense now to my professor's parents and to my professor. They flew back to India and finished off with the uncle's cremation. After grieving and cremating the uncle's body, my professor had not felt like there was something hovering her or being beside her anymore after they finished with what needed to be done. Story 18. The Midnight Visit. This is a story that happened to my mother when she was young and living in Laos. She was an orphan with only one brother, and they stayed with a couple who didn't have any children of their own. One day, 2 new siblings were brought into the house, and my mom, curious, asked the elderly woman they lived with, "Who are these kids, and why are they here?" The old woman explained that these siblings had just lost their mother and had no one left, so they'd be staying with them for a while. Only a few nights after they arrived, my mother witnessed something chilling. In the middle of the night, she saw the siblings' dead mother enter the room. She was wrapped in traditional Hung funeral clothes, with red and green cloths tied around her waist. All 4 children slept on the ground, side by side, in one room. My mom, as the eldest, slept closest to the door. When the ghostly mother appeared, she moved quietly around the room, sniffing the air as if searching for something. She looked at each of the children, then lay down, stretching herself horizontally across all 4 of them. My mom was terrified unable to speak or even move. She just lay there, eyes half open, watching in silent horror. After a few minutes, the ghostly figure of the mother faded away, and she never returned. Maybe she missed her children. But if the dead feel such things, you'd think they'd visit in a gentler way. Story 19, Crying Cats. I know you all have probably heard cats cry before, but has anyone had the same experience as me? My dad, a shaman, always warned us about raising cats. Then one day, my mom brought home a cat that looked like a tiger. It lived with us for a couple of years and had kittens that were pretty cute because they looked like little tigers. When the kittens got older, they'd fight constantly at night, and you could tell because they made that high, screeching roar sound. Anyways, at the time, we had an aunt who was battling cancer. She was constantly in and out of the hospital. Every time my uncle called my parents to go over because she might pass away, the kittens would fight. They didn't make the high roar sounds, but baby cries, and they'd scratch our screen door. Keep in mind, these are not house cats. We never let them in. Every night, my parents would go over. They wouldn't come back until 2 or 3 a.m., and the cats would fight until they returned. There were a few times they fought all night. This happened 4 or 5 times until my aunt passed away. The night my aunt passed away, my parents had already gone to Zov Thiab Said News, watch and take care of her until about 11 or 12 p.m. My dad worked the next morning, so my parents left early. Since my parents came home, I wasn't worried that my aunt would pass away, so I went to sleep. I woke up around 3 a.m., and the house was dead silent because everyone in my family snores really loud. At first, I heard people mourning like at funerals. Then I heard Kavniam, like Kuved Texiage, a traditional home song of lament. I tried really hard to listen and focused on the words. It was the cats crying outside. I thought, what is that? I slept on the bottom bunk, and my sister slept on the top bunk. Our bunk beds were springs only, so I kicked my sister's bed to wake her up, and I realized her bed was empty. I was confused and scared because the cats were crying and my sister was gone. I had a Buddha pendant under my pillow, so I took it out and wore it. I got up and was about to walk out of the bedroom to my parents' room. Then I saw this black figure in the hallway, standing at my parents' door, looking right at me. I stared right back at it, and my sister suddenly appeared and said, "Nunt CJ Muog." Yog, Kojak Zub. Kavn Shai Tagli. Face, it's just you. You scared me so much. Then I asked her where my older siblings and parents went. She told me that our aunt had passed away, so everyone left except for me, her, and my baby sister. She had to go sleep with my baby sister because she needed to babysit her while my parents were out. I then asked, "Do you hear that?" "What is it?" My sister told me the cats were just making noise and told me to go back and sleep. I was scared and refused to leave, so all 3 of us slept in my parents' bed. That night, the cats didn't stop crying until 9 a.m. Later, we moved to a new house, and my parents got rid of the cats. My grandma, who was also battling lung cancer, was in a similar situation. But this time, things got weird. My mom and I were cooking in the kitchen when the phone rang. My mom picked up and said, "Oh no, your dad and I have to leave right now. Grandma isn't going to make it." She called my dad to come home from work, and we continued cooking. Then suddenly, we both heard someone call Nayab, daughter-in-law. really loud, followed by knob, knob, yar. My mom and I instantly looked at each other, and she asked if I heard my grandma call her. I said yes, but Mom insisted it was just cats. When we moved, there were no cats in the neighborhood, just dogs. But my mom told me to be quiet. When my dad got home, he shooed the cats away, and my parents were about to leave. As my mom opened the door, a black cat jumped into the house, and she started yelling among Fivi. Niag de sov tom kaus pim. Niag pog humthoj. Sis pob tuxaj muag li los. Phij. Cursed thing. You dirty tiger. Old hum woman. Have you no shame? Get out. Then my brothers chased the cat out. By the time my parents got to the hospital, my grandma had already passed away 2 minutes earlier. The last encounter I had was when I was taking a nap on the sofa. I dreamed I was talking to a close friend about marriage. Then my friend told me to hurry up and wake up. I needed to stop being lazy. I forced myself awake, and it was 3 a.m. I lay there, playing on my phone when I heard cats crying again. It sounded exactly like a baby crying. I thought it was my baby nephew crying in my brother's room, so I got up to get him a bottle. I was standing in front of the microwave, heating the milk, when I saw my reflection in the microwave. I noticed a figure fully clothed in black. His face was wrinkled and burned, with a T-shaped mark on his forehead. I closed my eyes, waiting for the microwave to beep. As I waited, I felt something coming up behind me. I got scared and pretended to fall asleep standing up, hoping it would go away. And I felt a hard TAP on my left shoulder, not a tap but more like a finger pressing down. When the microwave beeped, it stopped. Then I remembered my nephew wasn't even staying over that night. My sister-in-law had already picked him up after work. I started panicking and felt paranoid. I turned off the kitchen lights and ran to my room, slamming the door behind me as I jumped into bed. I found my sister sleeping in my bed because she said she saw me in the kitchen with a guy who had a burned face. I told her to go back to the top bunk, but she refused because she said that whenever she couldn't sleep, there was a woman on the ceiling staring at her and making faces. That night, we slept together in my bed. The next morning, I went to shower and noticed a bruise on my shoulder, like someone had hit me with a metal rod. I told my parents what happened, and they called a shaman. The shaman said I woke up during the passing time of dead people. What I saw was Yaum Nuxyuvnyog, the messenger of death. A couple of weeks later, I got really sick and fell unconscious for a whole day. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, covered in red and white strings, with one from a high Buddhist monk that I still keep with me. I have to say, after everything that happened, I gained a sixth sense. Sometimes I can see dead people, and other times I can sense their presence. Story 20, sis. I think she looks strange. This happened a while ago when my family and I were on our way to visit some family friends who lived outside the city. It was pretty dark out, with only a few scattered houses as we drove down the quiet, rural road. The air was warm, but the night carried a strange chill. On our way there, we saw a girl about my age walking alone along the roadside. It was the middle of the night, and my parents were worried something might have happened to her. They decided to stop and ask if she needed a ride, since we had an empty seat next to me. I expected her to say no, like most kids would when approached by strangers. But to my surprise, she nodded and climbed into the car, sitting right next to me. From the moment she sat down, I felt something was off. She had long brown hair tied back neatly, and her clothes looked like something out of the late 1900s, formal yet old-fashioned. Her skin was ghostly pale, and her arms had scratches. Not to be rude, but she reeked like damp earth and rot. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. There was something deeply unsettling about her, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I shifted in my seat, my arm brushed against hers, and I nearly jumped. She was ice cold, like touching a block of frozen stone. She didn't even flinch or acknowledge me. She just stared straight ahead, completely still. My parents asked her a few questions, simple stuff, like what she was doing out alone at this hour. But she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. After a few tries, they gave up and drove on in silence. My sister, who was sitting in the back seat, kept trying to get my attention. She looked terrified, pointing at the girl and making faces like she was trying to warn me about something. I couldn't understand her at the time. When we arrived at the address the girl gave, we pulled up to an old house. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in decades, its wooden boards weathered and worn. My parents told me to get out and open the door for the girl. Reluctantly, I did. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight of the silence around us, with nothing but the creaking old house in view. Then it happened. The girl got out of the car, walked up to the house, and without opening the door, she passed right through it. I froze in shock, my blood running cold. I screamed and ran back to the car, urging my parents to drive away as fast as possible. On the way to our friend's house, my parents asked what was wrong with me, saying I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told them I had that the girl we picked up wasn't normal. Of course, they thought I was imagining things. But my sister, she believed me. She said that's what she had been trying to tell me all along. So now I'm left wondering, what did I really see that night? Was I losing it, or did we pick up something? Not from this world? Story 21, Jackson Street. I used to date a girl who lived on Jackson Street. Everyone in the area knew about the strange things that happened there. One weekend, her family went on a fishing trip out of state. She stayed behind because she had to work and asked if I could come over to keep her company. Across the street from her house was a forest, with their mailbox standing at the edge. That night, as we slept, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. The moment I opened my eyes, I felt a chill like someone was watching us. I've seen my fair share of paranormal things, so I tried to shrug it off. But something inside me kept urging me to look out the window. I remember using the dim light from my flip phone to guide my way, careful not to wake her. It was 2:30 a.m. The nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I knew I shouldn't look. It was Jackson Street, and nothing good ever happened at this hour. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. Standing by the mailbox was an old woman. She had long, disheveled hair and wore a dirty white dress. Barefoot and slouching, her face was hidden in shadows, looking slightly down. My heart raced. I tried to close the curtain quickly, but before I could, her head moved. Slowly, she lifted her gaze directly at me. Every hair on my body stood on end. I froze. It felt like she was staring into my soul. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before I snapped out of it, dropped the curtain, and climbed back into bed, forgetting all about the bathroom. Moments later, I heard a knock at the door. It started softly, just a light tap, but it grew louder until it sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. My parents used to tell me that if something bad is happening in a dream, you should pinch yourself. So, I did. It hurt. This was no dream. The pounding on the door continued for a few minutes. then abruptly stopped. Silence filled the house. It was an old place, and nothing had been updated for years. I lay there, listening, gripping the pocket knife I always kept by the bed. Suddenly, I heard creaking footsteps coming from the basement. Someone, or something, was walking upstairs. My mind raced. Could it be her parents playing a trick? I strained to listen as the creaking stopped. Just as I convinced myself I was imagining things, the basement door slammed shut. I bolted upright in bed, knife in hand. Whatever it was coming up the stairs. Slowly, one creak at a time. When the sound was almost at the top, I held my breath. The footsteps stopped just shy of the last step. The silence was unbearable. My heart pounded in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, the front door slammed shut. It sounded like someone had left. I heard laughter echoing from outside. Rushing to the window, I peeked out, but the old woman was gone. Everything was still. No movement, no sound, just an eerie quiet. I stayed awake, clutching the knife, checking the window every few minutes until exhaustion finally took over. The next morning, I asked her how she slept. She told me she had slept soundly through the night. I never told her what happened, and I never stayed the night at that house again. Story 22. The Unknown.
This isn't my story, it's my husband's.
I'm just sharing it on his behalf, and we would appreciate no rude comments. But if you feel the need, go ahead. Here's what happened to him back in April 2001. NOTE names are left out for privacy. In April 2001, on a rainy night, my husband was 16. He lived with his mom, 4 sisters, and 3 brothers. His father had passed away when he was 10. That night, his older brother was picking on him, forcing him to stretch into a split and stay that way while his brother showered. His younger brother was also forced to beat him up, and if he refused, the older brother would hit the younger one too. Out of fear, the younger brother would apologize and hit my husband. After 5 minutes of being in the splits, my husband finally got up and ran away. At that time, they lived in an apartment complex on 10th Street, near Sequoia Middle School. He ran from Hamilton and Cedar to the railroad tracks at Cedar and California, following the tracks to Peach and Church, near Story Elementary School. He noticed dark shadows following him, but he didn't think much of it. He continued to an empty farmhouse in a large field, where he slept for 3 to 4 hours. As the night got colder, he was woken by a strange sound, like someone licking their lips. Curious, he sat up and used a lighter to see. What he saw terrified him. A girl with long, fuzzy hair, bloody white eyes, and sharp, wolf-like teeth. Panicking, he ran down Church Avenue toward Chestnut, with the creature chasing him on all fours, its hands on the ground and feet by its elbows. The faster he ran, the faster it came, laughing as it got closer. He made it to his friend's house at 3 or 4 in the morning and started banging on the door.
When his friend opened it, my husband begged to be let in.
His friend looked outside and saw the figure, asking, "Who's that?" My husband simply replied, "Dab Ghost." His friend's dad came to see and saw the creature standing upside down on its hands, its feet swinging by its elbows, staring at the house. The friend's dad grabbed a wooden sword and began chanting, forcing the creature to leave. Afterward, my husband was told to get some rest and go to school, and not to think about what happened. His friend's dad explained that the creature wanted him to replace her so she could reincarnate. He tied a red string on my husband's wrist and warned him never to go back to that place. If he did, the creature would surely take him next time. Thank you for always supporting the channel and welcoming its videos. Wishing you good health, and remember to subscribe to the channel to achieve 1,000 subscriptions.